So today we are going to discuss all the books that I read in the month of November. But first, a shout out to the two books that I'm still currently reading. We have Guardians of the Moon, which is the first book in the Malazan Book of the Fallen series. I honestly think that I'm going to have this book done in the next 3 or 4 days, and I will have a dedicated review for it when I'm finished with it. And then we also have House of Leaves, which I'm taking my time on. I'm about 5 chapters in. This is a book that is full of articles and links to online resources, and some of these online articles are real and some of them are fake, and this author put so much into this book to make it feel as real as possible, which makes me just read it so slowly. But I'm trying to take my time and really just enjoy it. I know that it is going to be a lot faster of a read soon. Right now it reads kind of like a textbook, but I'm excited to get deeper into it. Now, as far as the books that I actually finished this month, I read 12 books this month and 1 manga, which seems a lot more impressive than it is because quite a few of these were very short. Anyway, as far as my ratings, we were pretty all over the place this month. Most of the books I read I did enjoy, but there were definitely a few duds for me in there. As far as genres, again, I had a good variety, still fantasy leaning because I love me my fantasy, but lots of different genres in there that I got to explore and enjoy. And now I'm going to tell you about those books, starting from the lowest rated, working our way all the way up to my highest rated and favorite books of the month. We are going to kick this wrap up off with my only 1-star review of the month, and that is The Duke and I. So this is one of my friend's favorite books. She has been wanting me to get into historical romance, and romance isn't really my genre, but there are some romance books that I love. I'm just pretty picky. But I did want to try out her favorite book because she's my friend. We were going to buddy read, we were going to discuss. I ended up not liking this book. I kind of expected it to be like a solid 3-star. It was enjoyable, just not really my thing, until we got about a third of the way through, and then it became a real bad read for me. I do have a really detailed review for this with spoilers and with a ton of typos because I was quite heated as I wrote that review. So I'll as always, I have my Goodreads linked in the description of this video, so go check that out if you want some more information. People have also been asking if I'm going to do like a rant review, and I'm not going to do a dedicated review for it, but it will make it into the least favorite books of the year video, so you'll see more detailed thoughts there as well. But to keep it real spoiler-free and real simple, basically, this was a book with 2 people that had great chemistry until they started manipulating, lying, and both emotionally and sexually abusing each other. It was a book meant to be dedicated to flawed characters, but it was still supposed to all be romantic. Instead, it was 2 people that had no respect for each other, that were unbelievably selfish, and that abused each other, and it was not romantic at all, in my opinion, and the resolution was a joke. I know this is a well-loved author and a well-loved book, so as I said in my Goodreads review, not trying to tell anybody how to feel, just expressing how I felt. Next book is going to be Call of the Wild. So this is one that I don't really have anything interesting to say about because my lower rating is more, it's not that I think the book was bad or even flawed, it's just that I didn't like it. So I gave my honest rating for how I felt about it. I don't tend to read books with animal protagonist where we're following the animal and inside the mind and thoughts of the animal, especially not classics. And that's partially because that's just not really something that interests me that much. And then on the other side of it is because, especially with classics, but really just in general, if you're gonna be following the perspective of an animal, that animal will almost definitely be abused. And I mean, it's just not my jam. Just don't wanna read it. But I did read this one because my friend was reading it and I was like, hey, you don't read very many classics. I'll read it with you, help encourage you to read it. And I didn't know what I was getting into. This book follows a dog who is domestic and has a family. Then he's pulled away from his domesticated life to be a part of the gold rush. He's going to be a sled dog. Is that what it's called? He's gonna pull the sled with a pack of dogs. Anyway, it's brutal. He's beat by humans. He is in attacks and fights with other dogs. It is painful. It is bloody. And there are very few bright spots in this book. My experience with this book was that it dealt with so many things that I didn't want to read about that I couldn't see past all the things I wasn't liking in order to be able to enjoy the purpose of this book. So entirely personal opinion, I didn't like it for personal reasons, but I get why so many people do. I also have classic wrap-ups every month. In case you didn't know, I'll link it up there. I'll link it in the description. But every single month I dedicate a whole wrap-up for the books that I read, the classic books that I read, so that I can go more in depth with them. So go check that out if you want to know more. Next is The Invisible Man. This is another book that was in my classics wrap up, so I'll keep this really brief. Basically, this is about a man who, through circumstances, became invisible of sorts. And then he decides to commit a whole bunch of crime because he's invisible. There's a lot more to it than that, but this is an incredibly short book, so I don't want to say anything else. I talk about this in my classics wrap up, so I'll keep it pretty brief, but basically, I think the reason I read this is because it's being adapted into a movie, and the trailer looked interesting, so I decided to read the book. And I think that the concept of the book was so interesting, and I really liked the story, but the execution of the story I really wasn't a fan of at all. And I said in my classics wrap up that this was my first book by this author, but I actually got this author confused with a different classic author, and you guys reminded me that I've already read 2 of this author's book, The Time Machine as well as Treasure Island. And I didn't like the execution of either of those books either. I thought with both of those books, the subject matter that was being explored was very interesting, but the execution I didn't like. So thank you for reminding me of that, because now I know that I think that this is just a thing with me and this author. I think that I just don't like this author's writing style. I love his ideas, but I don't ever like the execution. At least I haven't for the 3 books of his that I've read. Corey isn't into horror, so I don't know if he'll watch the movie with me. I maybe would check it out because I am really interested in the story, and I think that if some liberties were taken and if it were explored in a different way, it could be really cool. I just didn't like the execution of this book. Next book on this list is Wheel of Time, book 6. So I have been going through this series, reading a book a month for 6 months, and I love the series. It's been great. I have dedicated reviews for all of them, and I will link the dedicated review for this one in the corner and down in the description. I love this world. I love these characters. I love the progression. There's a lot that I don't love about this series, but what I do love far outweighs it, and it's been a great read so far. Book 6 has been my least favorite of the lot. Mostly, I just didn't feel like enough happened to justify 900 pages. I think that the first 800 pages could have been condensed to maybe 200 pages, and then we could have left the ending exactly as it was, because the ending of this book was phenomenal, and that's why it's getting a solid rating at all, is because the ending was so good, but the journey to get to the ending was honestly pretty hard, just because it wasn't interesting at all. I'm still really enjoying this series, and I still will continue it starting in January, but this book just wasn't, other than the ending, which the ending was 5 stars, the rest of the book was closer to a 2, which is why it ended up being a 3 for me. Next, I have Norse Mythology, which I still haven't rated on Goodreads, and I haven't rated most of these on Goodreads because I'm terrible at Goodreads. So I don't really know where I stand with this. Is it gonna be a 3.5? Is it gonna be a 4? I don't know. Anyway, this is Neil Gaiman, one of my favorite authors. So this is partially my fault, because I went into this thinking that I was going to either get a collection of stories based off of Norse mythology, or I was going to get one cohesive story based on Norse mythology. But what this actually is this is Neil Gaiman not even retelling, that's not right, telling Norse myths with his writing style flair. So it's just Norse mythology. He's not adding really anything to the story except for his writing style, which his writing style is impeccable as always, but it's not his story in any other capacity, really. And personally, I'm very good with books that are based off of or inspired off of mythology, but I don't really care enough about mythology at its roots to actually read a book like this. I still ended up enjoying it. That's why it still has a good rating, because Neil Gaiman makes me laugh, and he just has a writing style that I love so much. And some of the stories were genuinely interesting. Some of them I didn't care about at all. I'm glad I read it. I had a pretty good time reading it. And if you're interested in Norse mythology, I would say for sure go for it. Next is The Turn of the Key, and this is a weird book for me to rate. This is a horror book, or like a thriller, probably more so, a thriller book based off of The Turn of the Screw, which is a classic that I read last month. I actually love that I read The Turn of the Screw first, because I see how she drew so much inspiration from this, and that made the experience so much better. Ruth Ware did such an amazing job at the build-up. She created, well, let me tell you what it's about very briefly. This woman becomes a nanny for a family. She has her own secrets, and the family also clearly has some issues as well. Every nanny has quit very shortly after arriving for a while now, and it's because this house is rumored to be haunted and weird things go on. And that's all I'll say. The build-up for this book was phenomenal. The characters were properly interesting. You never really knew what was going on or if you could trust anything that was being said. And it was creepy enough that I had to stop reading one night because it was getting too late and I was getting creeped out, which is not a common occurrence. I love that. I loved this book. However, the conclusion was about as disappointing as it possibly could be. I really don't want to go into detail about it. So what I've done is I went ahead and did my Goodreads review, and I gave non-spoiler detail about why the ending was so disappointing, and I covered it with the spoiler tag so that people can choose if they want a little bit more information or not. But it will not spoil the book at all. It's completely spoiler-free. It's just maybe a little bit more information that some people would want going into their thrillers. I don't even know if I should recommend this book. I think that the execution of everything but the last 2 pages was phenomenal. But those last 2 pages were so disappointing. So I don't even know how to rate this book. I ended up giving it 4 stars, but is it with that disappointing of an ending? I'm not sure. Next is the single manga that I read this month, and it's 20th Century Boys Volume 2. This is a weird series. Really weird. The content in this is so off the wall and odd at times, but the story itself is so intriguing. Both volumes 1 and 2 I have disliked until about the halfway or the last, even the last quarter of it, and then suddenly I'm drawn back into the main thread of the series, the main thread of the mystery, and I'm like, it's so interesting that I have to keep going. It's the weirdest thing in the world, and yet I'm so intrigued that I'm gonna read volume 3. Is that a very good review? I don't really know. It's a weird series. I don't even know if I recommend it, but the main thread is so interesting, and I'm gonna keep reading and I'll let you know if it's worth it. So far, I'm really enjoying it. I'm pretty sure. Next book I'm gonna talk about is The Blade Itself, which is the first book in the First Law trilogy. This is a grimdark story, so just to be clear, it is pretty dark, although I do think that the first book was a softball for this genre. And it's also unbelievably character driven. I don't even really have a plot to share with you because this book didn't have a ton of plot. But it felt very intentional. It felt like the author was intentionally spending an entire book making us really, really know and care about these characters, and he's gonna take it somewhere from there. So even though I'm not necessarily the type of reader that loves books that are this character centric, I do like plot and world building with that, which this book had some of, but not nearly as much as I like. It was still so well executed and it all felt so intentional, and I did end up being so attached to these characters that I am so excited for book 2. I do have a dedicated review, so if you want more information on my opinions on it, and it is spoiler-free with 3 pros, 3 cons, so that you can decide if it's the right book for you, I will link it in the corner as well as down in the description. Next, I have another classic, and that is Withering Heights, which again, classics wrap up. It's in the description. You should check it out. I go into a lot of detail on this one. So this is a book that a lot of people will give you different ideas of what genre this is. A lot of people call it romance. A lot of people call it a revenge story. If you look at what the publishers have it written under, they call it a tragedy, and would agree. This book is published as a tragedy, and I believe that that was truly the intention of this book. To me, the book was a reflection of what characters can become. So this follows several characters that are raised in disturbed, abusive, and dysfunctional families. And this follows characters, specifically Heathcliff. I mean, it follows a lot of characters, but Heathcliff is the character that I really latched onto, that were treated so horribly and obsessed over how they were treated to the point where they were never able to get past it, and therefore became the people that they hated the most. This book means a lot to me, and I really, really want to reread it and be able to do a dedicated review and kind of kind of talk about all of the thoughts that are really rolling around in my head about this book, but the more time I reflect on it, the more excited I am to reread it eventually. Because to me, this is a reflection of how a cycle of abuse really can latch onto people and turn into a cycle, and how people can become the product of what has happened to them if they don't find freedom of that thing, from that thing. To me, it's a really powerful tragedy, 100% a tragedy. I don't know. I'm gonna reread it someday, and I'm gonna do a dedicated review, because now that I have an idea of what the story I believe is truly intended to be, I want to reread it now from that perspective, instead of like, I kind of went into this expecting not to like it and was surprised by it. And so now I want to reread it with the right perspective and have a really long discussion with you guys about it. Okay, next let's talk about the 2 Harry Potter books that I read this month. I read book 3 and 4, dedicated reviews for both, linked in the description. Probably one will be up there too. I've been rereading the series, and I've been loving my reread because the series is amazing and there's so much to discuss in it, and I grew up on it and I love it so much. I've spent enough time on both of these books. Both of these books have 2 dedicated videos, so we just gonna move forward. Okay, we're down to the last 2. So next is Call It What You Want by Bridget Kimmerer. So she wrote Letters to the Lost and More Than We Can Tell. And this I thought was a companion, because those 2 are companions. And I know she's writing a companion. She's writing Matthew's story. And I thought that this was what this was, so imagine my surprise when it's not connected to those 2 books at all. This follows Rob and Megan. So Rob's dad has recently been involved in a scandal, theft that affected a lot of families in the community, and after the fallout of all that, his dad tried to kill himself, and Rob was the one that found him, and they were able to save him, but now he's not in good condition, and Rob and his mom are in a very tough spot, and he's dealing with all of that. And then you have Megan, who has recently made a big mistake, and that's affected her reputation as well as her relationship with her family a little bit, and her sister turned up pregnant in less than ideal situations, and her family and her are trying to deal with all of that as well. So there's a lot going on in this book. Rob and Megan, this is their story as they deal with their personal lives that are really, really difficult, as well as a couple of side characters that are also going through really tough times, and it's Rob and Megan coming together. So Bridget Kimmerer, she tends to tackle really difficult subjects in a really raw, brutal, incredible way, as well as having really, really cute romances. So you guys, if you've hung out with me at all, you know romance doesn't tend to be my genre, but there are some romances that I love, and the ones that I love tend to be romances that are in the middle of a lot more happening, and usually in the dark contemporaries, usually in the difficult subjects where a beautiful romance blooms, and Bridget Kimmerer, man, she does it to me every time. I love these characters. I love their stories. It hurts so much to read this book, and I highly recommend it. Actually, let me preface this by saying that I haven't 100% finished this book, but it's in the wrap up because I know I will finish it today, but at the time I'm reading it, it's not totally done. So unless the ending sucks, you can go check out my Goodreads review and you can see if the ending sucked. Unless the ending sucks, you should read this book, because Bridget Kimmerer, she writes books, her dark contemporaries, she writes books that hit me right there. And the last book that I'm going to talk about is Things My Son Needs to Know About the World. This is a nonfiction. This is a book about parenthood, and it's written as a series of letters to his son, giving him advice and just kind of opening up his heart and being raw and real about how he's feeling, what he's afraid of. Frederick Bachman is a really interesting writer in that he will almost always start a book and you're like, what are you doing with this, man? And then he gets into it and he kind of makes a shift with his writing, and you come away like, holy cow, that was not what I was expecting. And with this being a series of letters, it was like he did that over and over again, where he would just ramble about something and I'm like, what are you doing, man? And then he'd make that shift. And I was like, oh, that hit me in the gut. And he did it over and over and over and over and over again through this series of letters. Some of them I didn't end up liking so much, but so many of them had me tearing up, and Bachman can get emotions out of me. I have annotated the snot out of this thing, and I have read several of these stories to Corey and marked several more for him to read on his own, and he says he will. But this, I don't know, man. I'm gonna reread this one too, because there's so many incredible stories, letters in this that meant a lot to me, and I want to pass it out to parents so that they can also feel understood. And like the way he writes, he puts into words what I have been feeling but didn't even realize what it all looked like until he put it in front of me. Bachman. Who? Okay, so these are the books that I read this month. I'd love to chat with you more about any and all of these in the comments. I post videos every Sunday, Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. I'll see you guys again soon. Bye.